Alright, welcome back to another video. In this video I'm going to cover what's known as CSS Grid Layout. So CSS Grid is a new CSS specification. It was just launched in most major browsers back in March, so early to mid-March. It has adoption across desktop browsers, and mobile browsers are coming soon. This purports to be the new standard for CSS layout, which means that we won't have to use frameworks like Bootstrap or Foundation, which are great, and those frameworks have a lot of things going for them that are not just their columns and row structures, but that's what most people use them for. They use them for creating, layout within a web page. So this is actually most likely going to kill that once everybody understands not only how to do it, but what they can do with it. And so in this video I'm just going to give you an introduction to Grid. Maybe you've seen an introduction, maybe not. Hopefully this will shed some light on how to set up your HTML and how to go about just manipulating some of the basic parts of Grid. I'm not going to get way into positioning and different things like that. I'm just going to show you the basic grid structure and how I would go about creating a responsive CSS grid structure for, let's say, an image gallery or some sort of card gallery or something like that, where you had rows and columns in a traditional gallery sense, and then what that would look like from a phone going all the way up to desktop size. So the first thing I want to do is introduce you to this really great guide. This has been up for a long time. It's been updated, but this has actually been online for the better part of a year, and I've been going through Grid and learning Grid since last fall. So fall of 2016 I started to learn and put some things together, and put together some code pins over at CodePen. And I'll show you some of those later, just to show you kind of what is possible, I guess, with Grid. And for me personally, I'm just going to throw this in there. I've been waiting for the web to get to this place where I can create the kind of layouts for the web that I've been thinking about for the last 20 years. I had this vision when I first started learning HTML and CSS that you would be able to do like magazine style layouts, and those things really appeal to me. I love design of magazines and print, and there was so much creativity that was available through programs like Photoshop, or I was even using Quark back in the day for doing large scale printing like newspaper. And that was my dream, for the internet, and it's taken a long time to get to that place. And I feel like now with CSS Grid we have a tool to be able to use so that I can actually envision some of those things and put them into an actual website, which I have been doing. And I'll show you some of those later, like I said. So let's get into the introduction. This is really good. So it tells you all of the different parts. So this is for the outer container, and this is for each individual cell. So you have control kind of both ends. And this up here tells you a little bit about it. So it's a two-dimensional system, means that so it can handle columns and rows together. If you've been using Flexbox, or if you've seen my video on how to use Flexbox to create a what is it called, a grid, it can Flexbox do it? Yes. Is it meant to? No. And Grid will actually allow you to create a two-dimensional grid on the X and the Y axis. It'll actually allow you to create that grid with less code and a little bit more flexibly, and do some things that you wanted Flexbox to do but it wasn't able to do because it can't handle X and Y at the same time. It only handles layout across either the X-axis or the Y-axis. So that's a big part of it. But inside of the CSS grid layout, you can use Flexbox, so you can turn any of those elements into a flex element just by doing display flex like you always have, and then manipulating the elements inside using flexbox. So they're actually meant to work complementary. It's just that flexbox came first and the grid specification came second, and now they're both here together and we can use them together. So let's get in. I have just some basic markup here. I have a grid container, and then I have 8 boxes. And so I've styled these boxes to be 200 pixels by 200 pixels. Right now they're just stacked on top of each other with no space. If I give it some margin, you'll see that they are in fact separated, right? Okay. We don't need that margin because we're going to create that gap using the grid container. Now the one thing that we need to do is you need to make sure that you have a grid container, and then inside that grid all of the child elements, so all of these boxes that are direct children of this grid, are going to line up according to the grid. So if you have something, if you have another something inside of each of these divs, that is not going to adhere to the grid. What is the grid is the box, okay, the direct children of this container. Alright, so let's set up grid. It's not difficult. So you find your container that you want to turn into a grid, and you just say simply display grid. And so that's how we start. Now in order to create the row and column structures, we use two different properties here. So one is the grid template columns and one is the grid template rows. So you're setting up your superstructure of the grid here. So let's do, I like to do columns first. And then what we have available is pretty much anything for a value. In grid there's a new value that's introduced. It's called an FR. An FR is it's essentially taking up the free space of one column right now, but you can set it to be 2 FR, which would be taking up two times the free space. It's called a fraction. That's the name of the unit, FR. And so let me just show you in action. So let's say we want to create a 3-column layout, and we want each of the columns to be equal sized. We would say 1 FR, 3 FR, right? So we say 1, 1, 1. Okay, so we have 1 column, 2 columns, 3 columns. There's a lot about this actual CSS structure that's going to point the way. Excuse me, it'll point the way to what your column is actually going to, or what your grid is actually going to look like. So it's very interesting, even the way that you set it up inside the CSS, because it feels, even when you write it, like you're writing the structure of your grid, which is really strange and interesting. Okay, and we could even do, let's say we wanted to do 2 FR. So now we have one space being taken up here, we have 1 space being taken up here, and then we have the middle one. This is the middle column, and it's taking up 2 of the free spaces. Okay, so it can be interesting. That can be 100 pixels. I'm sorry, 10 pixels. Let's do 100. So you can have them taking up different amounts of space. You could do this one being 150 pixels and this one being 200 pixels. So they're all taking up, you know, the amount of space that they need to take up for 100 pixels. We're going to stick with the FR units. So let's have a 3-column layout. One other way that you can write this is to say repeat. So let's say, you know, if you wanted to do 12 columns, you would have to write that out 12 times, and so they've got a shorthand to repeat columns. So you would say repeat, however many columns you want, 3, and then whatever unit you want them to be. So instead of writing out 1FR, 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 you could say 3, repeat 3, and then this is the value of each column, how wide you want them to be. So we have a nice flexible column that gives us the same amount of space for each column. So that's 3 columns. And then the other one is grid template rows. Normally, if you just want an auto flow kind of thing, you would set it to auto. And this just says when you run out of space, flow it down to the next one. You could actually set these to be 200 pixels, 300 pixels, and then 500 pixels. You know, you could set that to be something. You can see that this one is a little bit bigger, and these are a little bit smaller. So the first row is 200 pixels, which is the exact same size as our boxes, so that doesn't do anything for us. But we could set that to 300, 300, and then you can see this row is actually bigger. Okay, so you can set both how wide you want the columns to be and how tall you want the rows to be. So you have a lot of flexibility here. And if you do auto, then it just makes the rows whatever size the content is, the largest content. So that's how that works. And then when we want to put a gap between, so right now they're all kind of butted up against each other, but we use what's called the grid gap, and then we'll just say 1 rem for the grid gap. So that puts 1 rem of space in between the rows and between the columns, and you'll see it. So right there, the grid is its actual size, so you see it's 1 and 1, and creates a nice uniform structure. Let's see, it's called grid column gap and grid row gap will actually change those things. So if you say grid column gap of 1 rem and grid row gap of 2, then you'll see now there's one rem of space between the columns, and then 2 rems of space between the gaps. So if you want to separate those out, this is the shorthand. It does for columns and rows at the same time if you want that to be uniform. If you don't want it to be uniform, then you can separate them out by column gap and row gap. Okay, and then you create a nice structure. Now the gap is inside of the column. You notice that when we see it here in its fullness, it does not create margin, or it's not like margin. It doesn't create space on the outside too, or on the bottom. So you have whatever your normal spacing is outside of this element, outside of this grid element. Right now the body has I think it's 1 m of spacing or something like that. It has some sort of spacing around the outside, so that all the elements in the body are going to be, they have a little bit of padding. So grid row, or grid gap, I'm sorry, does not cover the outside of the grid. It only covers the gaps on the inside of your grid structure. If I add a background color to this, then you can see where, so the pink is our grid element. That's this div right here. So you can see that our grid lives inside of this element, right? And so when we get up to the line, then you can see that there's still padding, even though we've changed the internal padding between the elements. Okay, so that is grid column and grid gap. Now let's play with this to create something responsive, because look what happens. We've set our boxes to be a set height and width, so they have to keep that shape, and our grid is set to be 3 columns across, so whenever you do that, it's just going to break out of the viewport. Alright, so let's be good, and we'll start 320, which is the smaller iPhones, and let's just refactor this a little bit. So let's get rid of these things here, and we'll change this. So what we want when we're here is for it to just be let's say one column. This is going to be our initial state for the grid. You could also, one way to do this is to just allow the content to flow. HTML itself is responsive, so all of these elements here are responsive. If you did not set or if you set these to be let's say the width is 100%, and then we had a margin, let's say margin bottom 1 rem, you can see here that all of our elements are responsive. Okay, and if you had text in here, then that text would be responsive without you even having to make the box 100%. So you could start your grid layout like this, and then you can make it, as you move up, you can make it break out into a grid, and I'll just show you that right now. So let's say let's put our first breakpoint. So we want to have a 200 by 200 grid. So let's say at 425. So let's just copy this, and we'll say at media min width 425 pixels. I'm using Sass, by the way. You can still see, I think you can follow along if you've been doing CSS for very long, but essentially when you view the compiled Sass, it looks like this. Okay, you can see that I have auto prefixer, so it's prefixing some of these things. I think this Microsoft prefix is going to go away. They're actually working on a new version of grid specification, so that's coming along. So at media min width 425 pixels, we are going to say, well, grid, and then grid template columns. The terminology is a little bit cumbersome at first, but you get used to it. And then instead of one FR, we're going to have a 2-column layout. So 1 FR, 1 FR. You could also do repeat. At this point, with only 2 or 3 columns, it's not that big a deal to me. But I've done 12-column layouts where you wouldn't want to do all that stuff. So, so now you can see when you start out here, it's very responsive. And then when you get to here, you can keep that 100%. I'm going to change it to 200 pixels. So let's just do this, and then we'll repeat our media query at that at that size. So really the only thing we need to change is the width here, and we're going to make the width 200 pixels, and let's actually do no margin, since we have a grid gap that's going to kick in. So you see when I take the margin off, it creates a little bit of extra margin there, but when I make it margin of 0, then it creates the nice grid gap that we have, right? So one rem is what we have set. Okay, so we have our boxes start this way, and then at 450 pixels, when we have enough space to break them out into 2 columns, we can. But you can see what happens is, because we're creating two equal columns, it's not filling all the space because we've changed our box shape, right? So at 200 pixels each, somewhere around 600, maybe 615, 610. If we do it right at 600, there might be some overlap, but we can break it again. So we just copy that, and then at we can try at 600 and just see what it looks like. We'll add 1 FR unit, and then now we have a grid. You see how when it breaks, it creates a little bit of space here because we have the spacing in between. So really, you know, maybe you should do it at 610, or what is this, 665. Let's try that. So when we get there, it breaks, right? And when we get there, it breaks. So now we have a nice responsive 3-column layout. We could do one more. And we do that maybe at 900. And then we could add a 4th column, so that when we get to 900 pixels, then we have a nice 2-row, 4 across, so 4x2 layout for our 8 items. But you can see that all through the thing it's responsive. It's creating the row gaps for us, and this is all the code that we need in order to create that grid. Now, some people might say, oh, well, all I have to do is add classes in Bootstrap and I can come up with kind of the same thing. The problem with Bootstrap is that you have to load all of Bootstrap, or you have to parse out only the column structures of Bootstrap, and then you would have to take out all of the column structures and all of the column CSS, which is much bigger than what I'm showing you here, and you have to have the responsive styles, and you have to have everything else, and it can be quite cumbersome when you can just create the same grid using just this little bit of CSS with media queries to make it responsive. So you can see how this is going to cut down the amount of information in your CSS file. The smaller your files are, the less the user has to download each time that they visit your website, and which saves them time, it saves bandwidth, it saves on how much you have to download from your server to the people. So some people have download limits on the amount of information they can transfer from their server every month, and a lot of people who are on mobile, they have a lot of restrictions and limitations on how much mobile data. Not everybody's on unlimited mobile data, and so the less you make them have to download, the better off we all are. So CSS Grid purports to be kind of the killer of the Bootstrap and the Foundation framework, because we can create, I think, in some ways better column structures. And as you get into some of the more advanced examples, there are things that you just can't do with a Bootstrap or some sort of CSS framework. I can't imagine that you will be able to do that, because this is kind of auto-flowing all of the information, but you can actually take each of these elements and you can put them in specific spaces on your grid, from here to here and here to here, and create really complex layouts that are more akin to Photoshop than they are the web, quite honestly. So it's a really powerful tool. These are just the basics of it. You know, these particular these 4 things are going to get you pretty far just to create things like a gallery, and I'll create another video going into some more of the in-depth things, like how you can use flexbox type alignment for each of these elements as well. Let me show you some let me show you some examples here. I put together in my own profile a collection of CSS Grid. I'll show you this one, and then I'll show you this one. So these are some sample CSS Grid layouts. So I'm kind of collecting different things around the web when I see layouts that I like, but I'll show you a few of the ones that I've done just so you can see what's possible. Hopefully the internet will work with me here. There's one I like. Okay, so let's look at the full screen version of this, and this So this was a magazine cover. This is all created in Grid. You can see it here. You can see that I've used the repeat 12 columns, and then you can use auto on that. You could use 1FR, whatever you wanted to use. The grid width, I've actually set a width on the entire grid, so it's, you know, it's not responsive right now. And then I've set, this is where I showed you can put things in specific places, and then all the rest of this is just normal CSS, you know, where I'm going through and just writing normal CSS for the grid elements. I've set up the grid this way with the wrapper, and then I've set a call out and the site title, and then the text is its own thing. So all of these are, you know, they're grid elements. All of the images are grid elements of this. They're children of this grid wrapper. So all of these things are on a grid, and what I love is that you can begin to layer things on top of the grid. So these these pieces of text are real text. This is not, there's no images here. I didn't take anything out of Photoshop and add an image where there's writing on top of the image. This is real HTML text that's aligned to a grid on top of other images. I could create transparencies. I can create spacing issues. Let's see. I didn't. Usually on these I was putting a reference to the thing that I was, to the image that I was trying to recreate. But all of this is done with grid. Okay. And a little bit of flexbox I think in there too. Yeah. So I use flex as well. So you can see with the call out at the top. So up here I was also using flexbox in there to create the two rows, the column structure there. So you can see how flexbox can be used in conjunction in conjunction with grid. Okay. Second one, this is kind of a real minimalist type of design, but feels a lot more like a magazine type of layout. We have an image with a little bit of a caption over here, and then you have some column text. Again, this is just created with a grid wrapper, and then the image, the caption, the article, all of those are grid elements. And then I'm flexing the body, the entire body, so I can center everything. But the grid wrapper is here, and I kind of go through and explain, you know, what some of these things do. So 2 rows, they're automatically adjusting the height. I think I only need that once, but maybe I would need it 2 of them. I've repeated this, so it's kind of a 7-column grid, equally spaced. I fixed the width of the entire grid, and so it's not responsive or anything. And then the caption, you know, I've placed these elements in specific places. So when I use things like grid column and grid row, I'm placing them in specific parts of the column, I mean of the grid itself. So then you come out with something like this. It's very beautiful, very clean. And yeah, let me see if there's another one. Okay, here's a, sorry. I know this is getting on to the long side, but I've created a couple of other, these are just recently. I was thinking about what would be safe as far as magazine style layouts, what would be safe for the web, what would be easy to code, what would be easy to shift from a vertical structure on a phone to a horizontal structure on a large monitor. And so I've just been trying to create some examples of what I would deem to be kind of web safe types of layouts. So this would be one. You could use this for a blog or something like that. This one is responsive. There it is. So this one does. So this will be just kind of a large phone, and then it would start to move itself out to larger elements. Now this is all being put together with grid. It's a responsive grid. And then the column structures, this is just in CSS. This has actually been available for a very long time. So if you've never explored CSS columns, I encourage you to, because it can help you to create more of a magazine style or newspaper style layout. Okay. And then I'll just quickly show you a 12 column grid. This was just an example of how you can make a 12 column grid and how the column structures work with grid. And I'll just show you the code for that. And then let me see, here's some other examples. This is an example of how you can visually reorder things. So grid allows us, like Flexbox, to be able to reorder elements inside of it. So here you can see that I'm creating each of the like a 1/2, 1/2 grid, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, 1/4, 1/4, and so on. And so I'm recreating a 12 column structure. So this is full width, 1 column, split screen, 2 columns, 3 columns, a 1/4, 1/4, 1/4, 1/4, and then this is taking up 1/6, and then this is a 1/12 column. You can do columns just like you would normally do in Bootstrap or a framework, so where you could have a 1/4, 3/4 split, or vice versa, or 1/2, 1/2, or you can begin to place things in very strange and odd types of orders where you're skipping columns. So that's an option too in Grid, and I covered that in this one, I believe. Starting to lose my place here. Let's close a few of these. And yeah, so there's lots of really interesting things. So Jen Simmons is one of the leaders in CSS Grid, and so is Rachel Andrews. So if you're looking for some names or people to follow to learn more about Grid, those are the people. And Rachel Andrews works for Mozilla Firefox, and she has been heading the charge, and so is Jen Simmons, both of them with Grid. So here you can see just kind of a nice basic magazine style layout with a caption on one side. And then this one I kind of went all the way. And this one is these are a couple of my favorite ones that I've done here. So I'm only showing you these so that you can see what's possible. Okay, you're about to be freed from the normal website idea. Right? So you can see I'm skipping columns over here, and this was actually taken from a real article. All of this is just regular, regular HTML text. This is just a regular HTML element with text in here. Just between absolute positioning and grid layout, we can create some really interesting types of layouts. This is again not responsive. You would need to make it that way. And then this is a super interesting header. This is taken directly from a magazine layout where you have a grid structure here, and then down here this is also in the grid, but this is created I think this is created with a grid too. This is not flowing from one column to another, but this is all real text. These are all real images layered on top of one another. This has a border, and then that border has a transparency which was created in CSS. So a lot of super cool, super interesting types of layouts are coming your way, and they're available quite honestly right now to where you can use them. You can use them right now. So there's no holding you back. Whatever you see in a magazine can most likely be done. With CSS Grid. Like I said, the specification is working in every major desktop browser, and it's coming in the mobile browsers. So let's look at this one. This is just an example of a fluid grid. So you can see maybe on you have a site title, you have a main section, 2 sidebars and a footer, and then you can see how that comes to a more vertical orientation. These are taken from some things that Luke Wroblewski has talked about as far as like what are the best layouts and what are the best ways to do different things on the web. And so I was just trying to show how Grid can take care of that. You can actually see that here. And in a lot of these, there's a lot of these where I did a lot of explanation, and so if you want to take a look at the code itself, then it shows where I got things from. This one is inspired by this. So let's see if it's still there. Okay, so you can see this similar design here, and then this is where's it here? So here's the design I made. Here's the magazine layout. I've recently recreated this one as well. Let's see if I could find that. Where is it? I believe it's on the front page of this. But I was trying to recreate this this idea here, and I think it came out relatively close, very similar. So I tried to do that for several of the these layouts, just so you could see where I was drawing some inspiration from and where I was getting it. These are interesting because these are kind of magazine safe layouts. This is one that I just did. So you'd have a nice header image, some text. This is all done through CSS Grid. Again, I think they'll just use some margin on this. But lots of really interesting layouts that you can do that they don't look like your typical website. They look a little bit more like a magazine. You could definitely put some more details into them, and the details are going to make the thing. Okay, here's image masking. So I thought about how could you recreate this sort of idea of these split screens, and I thought, well, if we just did a grid mask over the top of a background image, that should get us there. And that's exactly what's happened here. So this is just a background image, and then there's this mask over the top of it. This actually is responsive as well. So you can see that the mask grows with the content, and then even in a small screen, there's a little bit of a split or an image mask there. So some really just kind of visually interesting and cool things that you can do as a designer. I encourage you to check that out. I'll actually link to these collections and things in the notes for this video. This video is long. I hope it's been a really good introduction. I hope you made it to the end. And I hope you're excited about CSS Grid because it represents a new way of developing for the web. It represents a new way of connecting designers who have been working in Photoshop or maybe in Illustrator, connecting them to the web. So hopefully the web will become a lot more beautiful and will become a lot more directed as opposed to just here's a box, here's a box, here's a box. We can fake a circle, you know, that kind of stuff. We are actually able to flow elements around the page and create something more visually interesting than we've been able to do before. So this is just a brief introduction to that. There's a lot more to learn. I encourage you to check out the CSS-Tricks. There's also another website called Grid by Example, where Rachel Andrews shows you some examples of how to create different parts of Grid. There are videos on there, there are written tutorials, so there's a lot of information on it. And I highly encourage you to get in, to start using it, and start working with Grid. It's super easy. The terminology, once you get past that, you know, that's a little bit of a hurdle at the beginning, but once you understand what's going on, you can create some really complex and beautiful grids. Thanks for watching. As always, if you have any questions, please leave them down in the comments below. I am pretty good at getting to the comments at this point. I don't have so many people who are subscribed or commenting that I can't keep up anymore. Please subscribe to my channel. I have lots of different stuff that I do. If you have any suggestions, like I want to see this or I want to see that, let me know, especially as it pertains to Flexbox or to Grid. Is there an issue that you're stuck on? Let me know, and maybe I can address it in a video. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.